These are your notes for Unit 10, Day 2 of Algebra 1. If you would like to see the warm-up, review question, or any homework questions we covered in class today, just look at the finished notes. So today we are going to learn a new method of solving quadratic equations, so an equation whose degree is 2. Last class we solved by taking square roots. Today we're going to solve by taking square roots, but in order to do so, we're going to have to do a process before that called completing the square, because we need a term that's squared in order to solve by taking square roots. So let's start by reviewing our knowledge of perfect square trinomials. So a trinomial is a polynomial with 3 terms. So x squared plus 6x plus 9 is a trinomial. If we go to factor that, remember you need 2 numbers. When you multiply them, you get 9. And when you add them together, you get 6. So when you go to factor that, you get x plus 3 times x plus 3. Now notice that's the same binomial twice, so you can rewrite it as x plus 3 squared. Now notice you have a term, x plus 3, that's being squared. So if that was part of an equation, you could solve by taking square roots. So another example would be 4x squared plus 12x plus 9. And that is also a perfect square trinomial. You can factor by grouping or you can factor by making your diamond, either way. So if I took 4 times 9, I'd get 36. So I need 2 numbers that multiply to 36 and add to 12. Well, that would be 6 and 6. So I would have 4x squared plus 6x plus 6x plus 9. Group the first 2. Group the second 2, plus sign in the middle. I can factor out a 2x, and I'd be left with 2x plus 3. And then I can factor out a 3, and I'd be left with 2x plus 3. And notice, when you factor out the 2x plus 3, you're left with a 2x plus 3. So it's the same thing twice, so 2x plus 3 squared. So how do you solve an equation like x squared plus 6x plus 9 equals 15? Well, we're going to learn a different way to solve this next class, or you learned a different way to solve this previously. We would get one side equals 0 and try and factor. But if you recognize that that side's a perfect square trinomial that would factor into x plus 3 times x plus 3, now we have x plus 3 squared is equal to 15. And just like we did last class, in order to solve this, we can take the square root on both sides. And remember, when you invent the square root, put a plus or a minus. And you're left with x plus 3 equals plus or minus the square root of 15. Well, to solve from here, get the x by itself. So I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides. And I get x equals negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 15. So you can write it as the solution with the plus or the minus, or you can write it as negative 3 minus the square root of 15 and negative 3 plus the square root of 15. And those would be your 2 solutions. So same thing over here. We already factored 4x squared plus 12x plus 9. We factor that up above into x plus 3 squared, and then we have equals 20. So same thing, if we want to solve, we can take square roots on both sides, and we would get 2x plus 3 equals plus or minus the square root of 20. Well, 20 is 4 times 5, so I could break that up into 2x plus 3 equals plus or minus 2 square root 5. And then to solve from here, we would subtract 3 from both sides. And we would get 2x equals negative 3 plus or minus 2 square root 5. And then divide both sides by 2. And we get x equals negative 3 plus or minus 2 root 5 over 2. And notice you have a binomial on top over a monomial. And so we can't reduce. And so we're going to leave it like that. All right, so notice in order to solve both of those equations, we needed a term that was squared. Well, in order to get that term squared every time, we can do a process called completing the square. So we'll have a squared term. So if you start with a binomial that has a squared term, like x squared, and just has an x term, like bx, you can make it into a trinomial through a process called completing the square. So in order to complete the square, so when you factor it, you would get a perfect term squared. You take the b, so that's the coefficient on x. You take the b, you divide it by 2, and then whatever you get, you square that answer. And that is the process called completing the square. So you take the b term, So whatever the coefficient is on x, you divide that number by 2, and then you square the result. And once you do that, you'll get a trinomial that you can factor into a perfect square. So on number 1, my b term is 8. So I'm going to take the 8, and I'm going to divide it by 2, and then I'm going to square that answer. Well, 8 divided by 2 is 4, and 4 squared is 16. So to complete the square, I'm going to add 16 to it. And then notice when I try and factor x squared plus 8x plus 16, well, two numbers that multiply to 16 and add to 8 are 4 and 4. So that's going to factor into x plus 4 times x plus 4, which is x plus 4 squared. And notice I've completed the square because now I have a term that's squared. So on the next one, y squared minus 12y, take the b term, which is negative 12, divide it by 2, and then square that answer. Well, negative 12 divided by 2 is negative 6, and negative 6 squared is positive 36. So I'm going to add 36 to complete the square. And then notice if I go to factor it, what multiplies to negative 36 and adds to, what multiplies to positive 36 and adds to negative 12 are negative 6 and negative 6. So that would be x minus 6 times x minus 6, which is x minus 6 squared. All right, m squared minus 5. Now notice this one, the 5 isn't even. So when I complete the square, I'm going to end up with a fraction. So I'm going to take the negative 5, I'm going to divide it by 2, and I'm going to square the answer. I'm not going to write it as a decimal. Negative 5 squared means negative 5 over 2, negative 5 over 2, which gives me 25 over 4. So to complete the square, I'm going to add 25 over 4. But now you're like, well, when I go to factor, what is this going to factor into? That looks like it's going to be hard to factor. Let's see if we can come up with a pattern from our first two. So when you went to complete this square, you took 8 divided by 2 and you squared it. And so our ending result was 4 squared. And then we got 16. Well, notice when we divided by 2, we got 4. And look what number that it factored into. And it factored into x plus 4. Over here, when we went to complete the square, we took negative 12 divided by 2, and we got negative 6, and then we squared negative 6 to get the 36. But look at this. When you took the negative 12 and divided by 2 and you got negative 6, look what number right here it factored into. It factored into x minus 6. That's going to be the pattern every time. So when I go to factor m squared minus 5m plus 25 over 4, it's going to factor into m, and then notice this negative 5 over 2 is going to be the number that's going to be plugged in right here. So it's going to be minus 5 over 2 squared. And I can prove that to you. If we have m minus 5 over 2 squared, that's m minus 5 over 2 times m minus 5 over 2. And if you multiply this out, you get m squared, and then minus 5 over 2m, minus 5 over 2m, plus 25 over 4. Well, negative 5 over 2 plus negative 5 over 2 is negative 10 over 2, and negative 10 over 2 is negative 5. So we get m squared minus 5m plus 25 fourths, which is exactly what we had up above. So if you want to go to complete the square and you end up with a fraction as your b over 2, it's still okay because it's going to follow the pattern. So whatever you got when you divided by 2 is what's going to happen when you go up to factor it. So notice when I took negative 5 and divided by 2 to complete the square, 25 over 4 is what I add. But when I go to factor, it's going to be m minus 5 over 2, which was what was in my parentheses, squared. All right, so why don't you guys pause the video and try and complete the square for each of these expressions, x squared minus 10x, y squared plus 24y, and m squared minus 1m. All right, so on this first one, we're going to take negative 10, divide by 2, and square that answer. And so we would get negative 5 squared, and negative 5 squared is 25. So I'm going to add 25 to complete the square. And then what multiplies to 25 and adds to negative 10, that'd be negative 5 and negative 5. So that would factor into x minus 5 squared. Y plus 24, we're going to take 24 divided by 2 and square that answer. So that's going to be 12 squared, which is 144. So I'm going to add 144 to complete the square. And this is going to factor into x plus 12, which is x plus 12 squared. And then on that last one, m squared minus 1m, we're going to take negative 1 divided by 2 and square that answer. So negative 1/2 times negative 1/2 is 1/4. So I'm going to add 1/4 to complete the square, but then remember the trick. I'm just going to take that negative 1/2 and it's what's going to go in the parentheses. So it's going to be m minus 1/2 squared when I factor it. All right, so if we want to solve by completing the square, you've got some steps. Step 1, you want to get the x squared and the bx term to be alone on one side. And so you want the x squared plus bx to equal whatever the number is, the constant. And then step 2, you're going to complete the square. But you have to add the new term to both sides. So since it's an equation, to keep the equation balanced, whatever you do to one side, you have to do to the other side. So on here, we have x squared plus 8x minus 5 is equal to 0. So I need to get the x squared plus 8x to be by itself. So the first step is I'm going to add 5 to both sides so that the number is going to be on the right side of the equation. So I have x squared plus 8x is going to equal 5. And now we're going to complete the square. So to complete the square, you take the b term, which is 8, you divide it by 2, and then you square it. 8 divided by 2 is 4, and 4 squared is 16. So to complete the square, I'm going to add 16. But remember, since it's an equation, whatever I do to one side, I have to do to the other side. So I'm going to add 16 to the other side as well. Now, I'm going to factor. So I'm going to factor x squared plus 8x plus 16. But notice I completed the square. So when I multiply to 16 and add to 8, I get x plus 4 and x plus 4, which is x plus 4 squared. And then it's going to equal 5 plus 16 is 21. And then my last step is I solve by taking square roots, just like we did last class. So now we're going to solve by taking square roots. So now to solve this, I'm going to take the square root on both sides, plus or minus. And then we have x plus 4 equals plus or minus the square root of 21. And then to solve, I subtract the 4 from both sides. And I get x equals negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 21. And that's how I would solve that equation by completing the square. So let's look at another example. X squared minus 12x plus 3 is equal to 0. So again, to solve by completing the square, the first step that we're going to do is we're going to get the x squared minus 12x on one side. So I'm going to subtract the 3 from both sides. And I get x squared minus 12x equals negative 3. And then I have to complete the square. So I'm going to take negative 12, divide by 2, and square that answer. So I get negative 6 squared, which is 36. So I'm going to add 36 to complete the square, but whatever I do to one side of the equation, I have to do to the other. So I'm going to add 36 to the right side as well. And now I factor. So what multiplies to 36 and adds to negative 12 would be negative 6 and negative 6. So I have x minus 6 squared equals negative 3 plus 36 is 33. And we solve by taking square roots. So plus or minus. And then I have x minus 6 equals plus or minus the square root of 33. And then to solve for x, I'm going to add 6 to both sides. So I have x equals 6 plus or minus the square root of 33. All right. So why don't you guys try both of these? So see if you can solve by completing the square. So pause the video and try these two. All right. So on this first one, remember, you want to get the x squared and the bx term to equal the number. Right now, it works. So now we're going to complete the square. So you take negative 2, divide by 2, and then square. And so we would get negative 1 squared, which is 1. So to complete the square, we're going to add 1 to both sides. So x squared minus 2x plus 1 equals 7 plus 1. And then we factor. So what multiplies to 1 and adds to negative 2? That would be x minus 1 and x minus 1. So x minus 1 squared equals 8. And then square root both sides. And so we have x minus 1 equals plus or minus the square root of 8. Well, 8 is 4 times 2. So this is going to be x minus 1 equals plus or minus 2 square root 2. And then to solve, we would add 1 to both sides, and we would get x equals 1 plus or minus 2 times the square root of 2. And so those would be my two solutions to that equation. All right, on number 2, we have x squared minus 10x equals negative 8. So again, the x squared minus 10x is on the left side, negative 8 is on the right, so we're good to go to complete the square. So we're going to take the b term, negative 10, divide by 2, and then square your answer. So we would get negative 5 squared, which is 25. So to complete the square, I'm going to add 25 to both sides. So I have x squared minus 10x plus 25 equals negative 8 plus 25. And then factor. What multiplies to negative 25 and adds to negative 10? That would be x minus 5 times x minus 5. So x minus 5 squared equals negative 8 plus 25 is 17. And then solve by taking square roots. And we would get x minus 5 equals plus or minus the square root of 17. And then add 5 to both sides. And we would get x equals 5 plus or minus the square root of 17. And those would be my two solutions, either x equals 5 minus the square root of 17, or x equals 5 plus the square root of 17 if you wanted to break it up into two solutions. All right. So what happens if we want to complete the square, but it's not just x squared plus bx, it's ax squared plus bx? Well, in order to do this, you have to factor out the a term first from both sides before you can complete the square. So your step 1 is you have to factor out a. So on this one, we have 4x squared minus 8x. So my a is 4. So I have to factor out 4 from both of those terms. So if I factor out 4, I have 4, and then I have x squared minus 2x. And now we complete the square. So now, after I factor out that 4, I complete the square using negative 2. So that 4 is going to stay out in front. If I complete the square on negative 2, I take negative 2 divided by 2 and square the result. And I get negative 1 squared, which is 1. So I'm going to complete the square by writing 4, and then x squared minus 2x plus 1 would complete the square on the inside. And then I can factor. So what multiplies to 1 and adds to negative 2? That would be negative 1 and negative 1. So this would become 4, and then x minus 1, or 4, and then x minus 1 squared. So if there is an a, and I want to solve by completing the square, I have to factor out the a, the number in front of x squared, first. So let's look at the next one. 9x squared minus 36. So first step, factor out the a. The a is 9. So I'm going to factor out 9, and I would have x squared, then minus 4x. And then we complete the square on x squared minus 4x. So I'm going to take negative 4, divide by 2, and then square my answer. And so that would be negative 2 squared, which is 4. So I have 9, and then x squared minus 4x, then plus 4 completes the square. And then when I go to factor that, I get 9. And then multiply to 4, add to negative 4 would be negative 2 and negative 2. So that would be x minus 2, or x minus 2 squared. So if we want to complete the square, first factor out the a term, if there is an a term, and then complete the square on the binomial that's left. All right, why don't you guys pause the video and try and complete the square for 1 and 2. All right, for number 1, to factor out the a term, we're going to factor out 2, and we'd be left with x squared minus 5x, and then complete the square on negative 5. You would take negative 5, divide by 2, square the answer, and you would get 25 over 4. So we have 2, and then x squared minus 5x plus 25 over 4. And then remember, when you want to factor, and it was a fraction, the number that it'll factor into would be the negative 5 over 2. So I would have 2. And then x minus 5 over 2 squared. And then 3x squared minus 24x. First factor out the 3. And then we would have x squared minus 8x. And then complete the square for negative 8. So negative 8 divided by 2 squared. That would be negative 4 squared, which is 16. So I would have 3. And then x squared minus 8x plus 16. And then if you go to factor that, what multiplies to 16 and adds to negative 8 would be negative 4 and negative 4. So x minus 4 or x minus 4 squared. So you have 3 and then x minus 4 squared. So if we're going to solve by completing the square, the steps are the same. So step 1, you want to get the ax squared plus bx to equal the number. That'll be our first step. But now step 2 is you're going to have to factor out a. Then it's the same steps. Then complete the square. Make sure you add to both sides. But you've got to be careful when you're adding to both sides. So I'm going to put a little asterisk there so you know what I mean by be careful when you're going to add to both sides. So on number 1, first step, we want to get the ax squared plus bx to equal the number. So I'm going to add 13 to both sides. And now I have 9x squared minus 36x equals 13. And now I'm going to factor out the a term. So I'm going to factor out 9, and I would have x squared minus 4x, and then equals 13. Then you complete the square. So I'm going to take negative 4, divide by 2, and square it. And I would get negative 2 squared, which is 4. So I've got 9, and then x squared minus 4x plus 4, and then equals 13. But notice, I invented that 4. I don't just add 4 to both sides. On this side, technically what I'm really inventing is 9 times 4. So if I remultiplied that out, I'm actually adding 36 to that side. So in order to keep my equation balanced, I have to add 36 to that side, or 9 times 4. So to keep my equation balanced, I have to add 36 to both sides. And then after I do that, I'm going to factor. So that would factor into 9, and then that would be x minus 2 times x minus 2, or x minus 2 squared. And that's going to equal 13 plus 36 is 49. And then now, I don't take square roots yet. Step 5 is you're going to divide both sides by the a term that you factored out. So now I'm going to divide both sides by 9 so that the squared term is by itself. And I'll have x minus 2 squared equals 49 over 9. And I'm going to leave that as a fraction. And now step 6 is I'm going to solve by taking square roots. So to solve by taking square roots, I'm going to take the square root on both sides. And I would have x minus 2 equals plus or minus. The square root of 49/9 would be 7/3. And then I'm going to add 2 to both sides. And I get x equals 2 plus or minus the square root, or not square root, 2 plus or minus 7/3. So that's a longer process if there's an a term and we want to solve by completing the square. So let's look at number 2. 2x squared plus 12x equals negative 20. So notice the ax squared plus bx are already on the left side. The number's on the right side. So step 2 says factor out the a. So I'm going to factor out 2. And I get x squared plus 6x and then equals negative 20. And then I'm going to complete the square. So I'm going to take 6 divided by 2 and square it. So I get 3 squared, or 9. So I'm going to add 9 to complete the square. But really, I'm taking 2 times 9 on that side. So I'm really adding 18 to that side. So I have to add 18 to the right side to keep the equation balanced. And then I factor, so that'll be 2. And then x squared plus 6x plus 9 factors into x plus 3 squared. And that's going to equal negative 20 plus 18 is negative 2. And then divide both sides by that a term. So I'm going to divide both sides by 2. And I have x plus 3 squared equals negative 1. And then I take square roots to solve. So I have x plus 3 equals plus or minus the square root of negative 1. Well, remember, we can't have negatives under a square root. They won't give us real answers. So there's going to be no real solutions to this problem. All right, let's look at some more examples. We have x squared equals 6x minus 3. So we need the x squared and the bx together. So in order to get that to happen, I'm going to subtract 6x from both sides. And I'll have 2x squared minus 6x equals negative 3. And then we're going to factor out the a term, so 2, and then x squared minus 3x equals negative 3. And then complete the square, so take negative 3, divide by 2, and then square the answer, and we would get 9/4. So I'm going to add 9/4. But really, I'm adding 2 times 9/4, so I'm going to add 18/4 to this side, 2 times 9/4. And then I factor, that would be 2. And then remember, when there's a fraction, I can just use that middle number. So this would be 2. And then it would be x minus 3/2 squared equals negative 3 plus 18/4. I'm going to put that over 4. So that would be negative 12/4 plus 18/4. So this would be 6/4. And then I'm going to divide both sides by 2. And I get x minus 3/2 squared equals 6/4 divided by 2 would be 6/4 times 1/2, which would be 6/8, which reduces to 3/4. So that would be 3/4. And now we solve by taking square roots, so square root, plus or minus. And we have x minus 3/2 equals plus or minus the square root of 3/4, which would be x minus 3/2 equals plus or minus the square root of 3 over 2. And then to solve, add the 3/2 to both sides. And we get x equals 3/2 plus or minus the square root of 3 over 2. And if you combine, since they have a common denominator, we can write 3 plus or minus the square root of 3 over 2. All right, why don't you pause the video and try number 2. Try to solve by completing the square on number 2. All right, so the ax squared and the bx are together and then equals negative 36. So then we factor out the a term and we would get x squared and then minus 5x equals negative 36 and then complete the square. So negative 5 divided by 2 squared, which would become 25/4. So I'm going to add 25/4. And then really, I'm taking 6 times 25/4, which would be 150. So I'm going to really add 150 over 4 to this side because that's 6 times 25 over 4. And then I factor. That would be 6. And then notice, since it's a fraction, I can just use the trick. And this would be 6 times x minus 5 over 2 squared equals negative 36 over 4 plus 150 over 4. So negative 36 times 4 would be negative 144. And so negative 144 plus 150 would be 6/4. And then I'm going to divide both sides by 6. And so I get x minus 5/2 squared equals 6/4 divided by 6 would be 6/4 times 1/6, which would be 1/4. So that's going to equal 1/4. And then I can take square roots on both sides. And I get x minus 5 over 2 equals plus or minus the square root of 1/4. And the square root of 1/4 is 1/2. So this is going to be plus or minus 1/2. And then I'm going to add 5/2 to both sides. And I get x equals 5/2 plus or minus 1/2. Well, I can write this as two separate equations. So 5/2 minus 1/2 or 5/2 plus 1/2. And so this would be 4/2, which is 2. So one of my solutions is x equals 2, and this would be 6/2. So my other solution would be x equals 3. So my two solutions are x equals 2 or x equals 3. All right, your homework is from 10.2. Let me know if you have any questions.